Okay, welcome back to Landscapes Live. We took a short break last week for EGU. If you've attended, then I hope you enjoyed yourself. We certainly did. And we're very, very happy to have Jeffrey Kwang from the University of Massachusetts, or right now, actually, from the University of Minnesota at Twin Cities. Jeffrey's stepping in for Isaac that couldn't make it. So thank you very much for making it last minute. And we're very excited to hear him talk about the future of soils in the Midwestern United States. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everyone can see? Okay, so my name is Jeffrey Kwang. I'm currently a NSF postdoc fellow at the University of Minnesota. And today I'm going to talk about basically a pandemic project that I did with Isaac at the University of Massachusetts. So we're going to talk about the future of soils in the Midwestern United States. Okay, so again, I'm not Isaac Larson, but I worked with Isaac Larson. Here's Isaac Larson on the left. And then this is a group of students that I worked with and postdocs in the Midwest. And my role in this group was I'm a landscape evolution modeler. I've previously studied how mountains form and how drainage networks develop. But I did my PhD in the Midwest, and I would drive through these landscapes a lot and not think anything of them because they were pretty boring to me. But Isaac had convinced me that there's actually things happening on these landscapes. So you need to be Isaac to kind of observe this, because I would just pass by these and I just see flat landscape. But what Isaac, the way that he pitched this idea to me is that you can observe light soils and dark soils on the landscape. And typically you'll see these lighter soils on the hilltops or the hill slopes of these agricultural fields. And if you take some of the soil from the low spots of the landscape or the hollows, and you bring it up onto the hill slope and you smack it next to each other, you can see that there's this stark color difference. And the reason there's this difference is these dark soils are coming from the A horizon, which is the top of this soil profile. And below it is this B horizon, which is usually a lighter soil. So what this is telling us is on these hilltops, a lot of the A horizon is missing. It's just B horizon. And you can see this in most places in the Midwest. So here's Iowa, and you can see these light spots that are on the hilltops, and this is exposed B horizon. Here's South Dakota. Here's Minnesota. Here's Nebraska and Illinois. So a lot of the topsoil or the A horizon is missing. And this is important because soils provide about 95% of the food in the world. And if you're missing the A horizon, it can reduce your crop productivity. And crop productivity needs to increase because our populations are going to increase into the future. So it's been hypothesized that we have to actually double our crop production by 2050 to account for the population increase. And because crop productivity sometimes declines, we compensate by using artificial fertilizer. But the overapplication of these fertilizers can cause degradation to water quality and also produce algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. And last, soil stores the most amount of terrestrial, it's the largest terrestrial pool of carbon. And when we move soils at an accelerated pace from agriculture, it can actually move enough carbon to influence the global carbon cycle. But there's not a full understanding of whether this movement of carbon is a net source or a net sink of atmospheric carbon. Okay, and then last we're looking at the Midwest because one, it's one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the world, and at least in the United States, it provides the majority of the corn and soybeans. And if you look at this map in the bottom right, you can see that these red areas are areas that are susceptible to erosion. So these areas can start eroding, and that's important because this is where most of the carbon and most of the food is produced in the United States. So this talk's going to be organized into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about where agricultural soil erosion has actually occurred. This is work mostly done by Evan Thaler, the PhD student that before I arrived at UMass. Then we're going to talk about in those locations where soil erosion has occurred, how much is actually moving. And Caroline, Brendan, Evan, and I work together to solve that. And then last, I'm going to talk about can we predict how much will occur in the future? And that's more of the work that I focus on. So again, looking at this soil profile, we can see that there's the darker soils on top and the lighter soils on bottom. And this correlates well to what the amount of organic carbon that's actually in the soil. And if you use a spectral radiometer to look at the spectral properties of these soils, you can see that there's a definite spectral signature. And Evan wrote a paper developing this soil organic carbon index. It's a simple ratio between the blue bands and the green and red bands. And it does well at predicting how much actual soil organic carbon is in the soil. So in the dark areas, there's more, and in the lighter areas, there's less. And this ratio is able to basically predict this. And one thing that's really nice about this tool compared to other tools is that it only needs the visible spectra. So that means you can use a satellite image, you could use a drone image, you could use your cell phone, and you can calculate this index and predict what soil organic carbon is. So they used this index to delineate locations where there's high soil organic carbon and low soil organic carbon. And they were able to predict areas where there's a horizon and where the a horizon is missing. And they wanted to do this over the entire Midwest, but the issue is that this high quality imagery is really hard to get in some locations because there could be snow, there could be vegetation, there could be clouds. It might just not be the right time of the year. So we have the imagery in a subsection of the Midwest, but we weren't able to calculate the full Midwest extent of where the B horizon's exposed. But what Evan did was they compared the areas where A horizon has been removed to curvature, and they found that there's a really good correlation between convex areas, so the hilltops, and where B horizon is exposed and A horizon is missing. And unlike imagery, we have LiDAR across most of the Midwest. So over about 400,000 square kilometers, we have LiDAR. We can calculate this curvature value, and then using the relationship between curvature and B horizon exposure, they can predict how much A horizon's actually is actually gone. So they found that about 35% of the Midwest no longer has any A horizon soil. So this is the locations of the light soils. And this is completely underestimated by the USDA because the soil survey indicates that there's still A horizon in almost all locations in the Midwest. Okay, and this has its costs because if A horizon's missing, your crop production will go down, and they estimated about every year there's about a 60% decrease in crop yields, and this equates to $2.8 billion a year annually. And for a farmer in the Midwest, this is about on the order of tens of thousands of dollars. So it's not a small amount. Okay, so soil erosion seems to be correlated to this topographic curvature, and there's something driving all this agricultural erosion. And the answer to this is that there's this thing called tillage. So tillage is an agricultural preparation method that's used to stir up the soil and get it ready for seeding and growing crops. And you can see in this GIF that it moves the soil dramatically. So yeah, soil erosion is connected to this topographic curvature. And when you think, I guess as landscape evolution people, when we think about landscapes, when we see that something is related to curvature, I think the first thing that may pop in your head is that there's some sort of diffusive effect going on. So tillage has been studied a lot, especially in Europe, and they found that it does have a diffusive effect on landscapes. And the thing that's interesting here is that in our assessments of soil erosion, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, they don't consider tillage in our national assessments of where soil erosion is actually occurring. Okay, so we know that there's about 35% of the A horizon missing, and we know where it's where the soil is missing, but how much is actually gone. So on the intro slide, we saw these images, and you might ask, like, why are we always standing by these fences? Well, these fences are the boundaries between fields and prairies. So these pristine prairies are landscapes that have not been touched by cultivation. And in the 1860s, Europeans settled in this area and basically cultivated the entire landscape. So there's only about 0.1% of the landscape that's actually pristine. And when you look at these boundaries, there's about a 30 to 50 centimeter step. So it's indicative of how much erosion has actually occurred. So we went to a lot of these prairies. Evan scouted out a lot of them. And we took a RTK GPS, or high resolution GPS, and we measured this boundary between the prairie and the field. And we measured how much, the thickness of what the soil loss is. And if you know when the area was cultivated, and you know the thickness, you can get an erosion rate. So here's some of the locations where we found the prairies, and we had permission to go in the fields to measure the boundary. And we found that the median reduction of soil, the thickness of it, is about 28 centimeters. And if we convert that into erosion rates, we get about a 1.9 millimeter per year. So I think for most people that study landscape evolution modeling, that's kind of a very big number. And this gray value here is this thing called a T value, and it's the USDA soil loss tolerance. And it's equal to about 1 millimeter per year. And what this value is, it's a value that says it's the maximum erosion that USDA is willing to tolerate without, and if you go over this value, they think that it'll actually be lost to agricultural productivity. But if you stay below it, there shouldn't be a loss. So if we think about this in kind of like a word equation, if you have your change in your soil, you have a change in soil thickness is equal to how much stuff you put into the soil and how much stuff you remove. So it's a production minus the soil erosion. So if we have an erosion rate of 1.9 millimeters per year, and if we assume that the T value is the soil production rate, if you have a 1 millimeter per year, this is just not a sustainable way to manage our soils. But what if that 1 millimeter per year value is not correct? So what is the actual soil production rate? So in a sustainable soil where the soil thickness stays about the same, the soil production should equal the soil erosion. And in order to get what this soil production rate is, we went back to those prairies and we measured these beryllium-10 concentration profiles. So beryllium-10 develops because there's cosmic rays hitting the surface of the earth. It develops into this exponential profile. I'm not going to get into this math, but what you can find is if you know the shape of this profile, you can figure out what the erosion rate is. And if these landscapes are at an approximate steady state, these prairie landscapes that have not been touched by cultivation, then we can assume that the erosion rates are similar to what the soil production rates would be. So here's the sites that we looked at. To get these profiles, we had to auger about 3 to 4 meters deep, and then we could solve for the erosion rates. And when we solve for the erosion rates in these prairies, we find that the median is about 0.04 millimeters per year. So it's significantly below this soil tolerance value. And if these soils can only produce soil at a rate of 0.04 millimeters per year, even if we're slightly below the tolerance value, it's not a sustainable soil because we're going to be removing more than can be reduced. And if we compare the natural erosion rates to agricultural erosion rates, we find that the agricultural erosion rates are about 10 to 1,000 times faster than the natural rates. So just to recap, so we know that agricultural soil erosion is orders of magnitude faster than natural soil erosion. We know that tillage erosion is one of the main drivers of this erosion. We know that tillage erosion is typically thought of as a diffusive process, so maybe we can model it. So that's kind of where my research plays a bigger role. So I developed this model called the Landscape Evolution Model, Soil Organic Carbon, or LEM-SOC for short. And basically, it's a diffusion model. It's a hillslope diffusion model. So soil in this model is redistributed based on hillslope diffusion equation. And really all it says is that the change in elevation depends on what the topographic curvature is and what your diffusion coefficient is. So this D term, you're going to see this a lot. This D term is important to how the model works. And then this model also can track where soil organic carbon is. That's the second part of the acronym. And soil organic carbon is redistributed by the soil. So it's in the soil and it moves around the landscape in this thing called the plow layer. So the plow layer is this top 10 to 20 centimeters of the landscape that's well mixed, because when you run your tillage implements on the landscape, it mixes this top 20 centimeters. That's how about how far it digs into the landscape. And the way this model works is to track soil organic carbon. So a typical landscape evolution model is a 2D model where it's just modeling the surface. This is a 3-dimensional model because we see what's actually occurring in depth. So when there's net erosion at any point in the landscape, the plow layer is lowering. And when the plow layer lowers, it eats into the subsoil. So the subsoil is then incorporated into the plow layer. And when you have deposition, the plow layer raises, and then it actually deposits stuff into the subsoil. So this way of tracking how the plow layer interacts with the subsoils is what makes this model a 3-dimensional model. So just to kind of run a little test case, here's a completely flat landscape, a numerical landscape, where I added a small perturbation. So there's just a little bump. And then below the bump, we have an A horizon and a B horizon soil. So it's darker to lighter. And when we diffuse this landscape, what you'll see is this bump start to dissipate. And then you'll also see the B horizon starting to be exposed. Okay, so I'll just play this model. So you'll see the bump is lowering and the B horizon extent, this light soil starts to expand. Okay, so in order to kind of calibrate this model, we have this goal of first trying to reconstruct, to make sure that this model works, we need to be able to reconstruct soil and SOC redistribution from European settlement to today, so 1860s to 2020. And then another goal is to find out what's this diffusion coefficient. So since it's a numerical model, we need a few data inputs. So we need some initial conditions, we'll need topography, we'll need to know what SOC, the 3-dimensional SOC distribution is. So it's called the SOC pedostratigraphy. And then to calibrate the model, we have a target of trying to calculate what the current SOC spatial distribution is that we see in satellite imagery. So of the many sites that we visited, we chose 3 sites where we did more extensive soil sampling and coring. And in today's talk, instead of going through everything, we'll just go through one of these sites. We'll go look at the Willis site. So first we need this topography. So just to orient you to like the field site, there's this blue block, this blue box, which has the which is the prairie, and then there's this red box, which is the field. And again, we're assuming that this blue box is a representation of what the landscape looked like in the 1860s. And then this red box is where we're going to run the model. So the goal is to simulate what happened from 1860 to 2020 in the field to make it look like a prairie and to what it is today. So we have LiDAR DEM. So here's just the DEM that we have. But the issue is, in the way that we define the model, we want the initial condition to be 1860. And this is a DEM of today. So it's not the exact right DEM that we need, but I will show you how we correct for this later in the presentation. Okay, so we have at least an idea of what the topographic elevation is. And then in order to get the pedostratigraphy, we went to the prairie. And we took, from those 3 sites, we took 33 cores, and they're about ½ meter to a meter in depth. And we took it back to the lab, and we measured the hyperspectral reflectance with a spectroradiometer. So we're basically measuring what SOCI is by looking at the blue band, the red band, and the green band. And if you look at these profiles, we can see that there's this exponential decay. So the soils start out dark, and then they get lighter as they go further in depth. And we fit this exponential equation shown here in orange, where A is this minimum term. So SOCI doesn't go to 0 as it goes further into depth. It actually goes to like a value of 2. The sum of A and B represents the surficial value of what SOCI is. And then C is this decay constant. So it tells you how fast does the soil get light as you go down in depth. So we calculate for every profile these parameters, and we also took note of where their location was, and we figured out what their curvature values were. And if we relate the curvature to these parameters, we see that there's a nice relationship between them. So first, this plot here shows that as curvature increases, you have an increase in surficial SOCI. So if we have this kind of idealized one-dimensional landscape where we have a hilltop and a hollow, in the hollow we'll have this exponential profile. And because the negative curvature areas have a lower curvature value, we expect there to be a lower surficial SOCI value. And then for the decay constant, we found, again, another nice relationship where the decay constant decreases with curvature. So here, again, if we have this positive curvature area, there's a slower decay with depth. So it means that it has higher SOCI values as it goes down in depth. But if we go to the negative areas, not only does it have a lower surficial SOCI, the SOCI value also decays faster with depth. So we take these relationships. So if we know the curvature in every location in the landscape, we can calculate what A, B, and C are, and we can calculate what the surficial SOCI values are and what SOCI or SOC should be in depth. Okay, so now we have an idea of what all the initial conditions are, and then what are we shooting for in this model? So if we take the field and we look at the satellite imagery, we can calculate SOCI with Evans' algorithm. And then we have an idea of where the locations of dark soils are and where the locations of light soils are, or carbon-rich and carbon-poor soils. Okay, so now we can construct the model. So this is just this is the Willis field. It's not, it's a lot flatter than this. This is exaggerated by 5. And we can see initially when we create this landscape, we have mostly SOC poor materials. And then there's this kind of shallow layer of SOC rich materials. And then I'm going to play this model, and we're going to just diffuse this landscape with a diffusion coefficient of 0.2. So this is just a kind of an example simulation of what can happen. So as you run the model, the things that you should notice are first, that the light SOC poor soils emerge from the hilltops as we see in the field, and then this extent expands over time. So it starts to blanket the entire landscape. And it's a 3-dimensional model, so we can also see what's happening in depth. So if we take a transect of the landscape, this is what it looks like. So we can see that there's darker materials in the positive curvature areas because of the parameters that we calculate it for the depth profile. And we see that the soils are a little bit lighter on A, but there's still a darker soil on the top. So as we run through the evolution, it's a diffusion model. So we see that there's erosion in the negative curvature areas and there's deposition in the positive curvature areas. And if we take a zoomed in image on the side slope, we can see that the model also reproduces some things that we see in the field. So this is a soil inversion where we see, instead of there being dark soils on top of light soils as we expect, there's actually light soils on top of dark soils. Okay, and then to find the diffusion coefficient, we go through this procedure where we kind of guess what diffusion coefficient should be until we match the model results to the observed results. So if we start with this initial topography and use our functions to find the initial SOC pedostratigraphy, we can calculate what will happen in the future. So this is, instead of showing topography over time, we're going to show change in elevation because the topography doesn't change too much. But this is after 40 years, you see this much erosion and deposition, and then you can see this is how the surface of the SOCI changes. And if we go another 40 years and then another 80 years to 2020, we can see we see this expansion of the exposed B horizon. Okay, so if we compare, on the left is the satellite imagery, the observed data, and then if we compare it to our model results, we see that generally, if we use the right D value, we can get a good fit between the observed data and the model data. But that requires, I guess, in that procedure, that requires a lot of guessing, and that means a lot of simulations. And the nice thing about diffusion is that you can semi-dimensionalize, or you can make the model semi-dimensionless, and you only need to run one simulation. So here's just a few of the equations, the conservation equations. The thing to kind of take in is that we use this dimensionless time where it's related to a reference length scale and the diffusion coefficient. And what all this means is, for example, if we have this landscape that we diffused using a D value of 0.2 for 40 years, this landscape is actually identical, or this result is identical if you use a diffusion coefficient that's 0.1 and you diffuse it for twice as long. So if you use a diffusion coefficient that's half of 0.2, but you diffuse it for twice as long, you get the same result. And you can change diffusion coefficient, and it will just change what time it actually represents. So what this means is that you only need to run one simulation. And as long as you output enough data, you can essentially stretch the results with the D value until you get 2020 to look like what we see today, what the observed data is. So when we do this for all the sites, we get pretty good fits for diffusion coefficient. But I just want to kind of, one thing I want to do is back up a little bit. Remember, we had that issue with the initial topography. The initial topography that we used in the model was from 2020, and it wasn't the 1860s data. So when we look at the prairie in the field, we see that generally the prairies have more curvature than the fields do. And that's because the fields are just diffuse versions of the prairie topography. So what this ends up resulting is that some of the D values that we initially calibrated, let me go backwards. In this slide, they're probably overestimated. Okay, so the way to think about this is the black box is my model, and we need to initialize the model with the 1860 topography to get an unbiased estimate of what D should be. But since we don't have a time machine, we can't go back to the 1860s and measure it. So instead, we use the 2020 topography, but because curvature is less, D has to be higher in order to compensate for the smaller curvature value. So in order to move the same amount of stuff, you need a higher D value. But one thing that we thought about was like, can we make it, what if we made it worse? What if we diffuse the landscape even more and use it as our initial condition? We would further overestimate D. So why would we want to do that? Well, what we did was we did just that. We kept diffusing our initial condition and feeding it into the model, and then we got the expected overestimation in D. And we found that D increases as your estimate of D increases as you diffuse that initial condition. And the thing that's nice is that this is kind of it's a linear function. So if you extrapolate this function back to 0, you should get an unbiased estimate of what D is. So when we shoot the function back to 0, we find a D value of about 0.14 to 0.4 meters squared per year. So what does that value actually mean? There's a paper by Fernandez and Dietrich that looked at natural hill slope diffusion coefficients. And I remember in their chart, one of the highest values that they got was 0.04. So the highest natural value of diffusion coefficient that they measured was 0.04. But the measurements that we're getting from these agricultural fields is at least 1 order, or it's about 1 order of magnitude larger than the fastest rates that we've measured naturally. So in summary, this model is able to reproduce SOC or SOCI patterns in agricultural fields just by using a diffusion model. There's no water erosion in this model, and we tested water erosion, and it didn't make the results look any better. And then it seems like, yeah, because the water erosion didn't have any effect, it seems that diffusion transport or tillage has a first order control on where soil is moving in these landscapes. So you can find the development of this model in this JGR Biogeosciences paper that we wrote that came out last year. Okay, but this talk is about the future of soils. So can we use this model to predict what's going to happen? So the goal now is to predict soil and SOC redistribution and beyond 2020 across the entire Midwest. And again, because this is a model, we need initial conditions. And the initial conditions that we need are, again, topography and SOC pedostratigraphy across the entire Midwest. This paper is going to be, or the work that I'm about to show you is featured in Earth's Future paper that just got accepted. So it should be out in a few weeks. Okay, so 2-dimensional digital elevation model. So we have that. It's covering 403 counties across 10 states. And the study area, again, is about 400,000 square kilometers. And we use a 4-meter resolution. Yeah, I'm only going to show these, like, we're showing all this data in a few slides, but this took many pandemic weeks to develop. And Evan basically did this for me. We also prepared the DEM by removing things that would mess the model up. So first, we used the USGS gap analysis, which is it's a land cover data set. And we only chose the areas that were labeled as herbaceous agriculture. And then we had to further filter this DEM by removing things that would cause anomalous curvature values. So the model depends on curvature, and we only want to diffuse soils in agricultural fields. We don't want to diffuse like light posts or power lines or things like that. So we also filtered out waterways, fence lines, power lines, roadways, and boundaries and things like that. So we prepared that elevation model, and now we need the pedostratigraphy. So there's a gridded soil survey geodatabase from the USDA, and they actually have soil organic carbon concentrations at different depth increments. So there's our data set that we can use to input into the model. And if you look at this plot, you can see that there's some definite patterns of where there's darker soils and lighter soils. And one thing to notice that's interesting is this red line delineates the last glacial maximum. So this is the last place where the glaciers were before they retreated. You can see that they deposited soils in such a way that there's higher soils north of this last glacial maximum and lighter soils south of it. So we took some of our field sites and we used the GSurgo data set, and we compared it to some of our more detailed model results. We found that it's not perfect, but it does show good agreement. Okay, so now we can run our model, but now we have to figure out what D value to use. So our small scale runs found that D should be between 0.14 and 0.4. But the problem with this value is that it integrates times when the soil was prepared with non-mechanized tillage, and areas where, or in times where it was prepared by mechanized tillage. And mechanized tillage in the literature seems to have a higher diffusion coefficient. So this value is a little bit lower than what we want to use. But the good thing is that D values have actually been calculated in other locations. And there's a paper by Van Oost et al. In 2006. They found that D has a pretty narrow range of values between 0.37 and 0.67. So we use that as a range. And then another issue is that not everywhere in the Midwest is actually conventionally tilled. So they don't use these huge machines to prepare their soils. There's actually locations where they use this thing called conservation tillage. So in this plot right here, it shows areas where there's more conservation tillage and there's areas where they use more conventional tillage. And the areas that are green are using conservation tillage. Another word we use is low intensity tillage. And then these areas that are lighter are areas where they use conventional tillage, where they're actually moving the big machines through the soils. So this paper that this distribution of where they use conservation tillage and not conservation tillage was produced from data from Azari et al. And they use remotely sensed data to figure this out. And in most cases, they classify things as either high intensity tillage or low intensity tillage. And we assume, because most of the low intensity tillage is classified as no-till, that low intensity tillage is basically the same as no-till. So if we look at the entire Midwest, we found that kind of the region that we're looking at, the average proportion of places that are actually using low intensity tillage is about 40%. So 40% is using low intensity tillage, 60% is using conservation tillage. And we use a different D term because conservation tillage or low intensity tillage or no-till, we'll just keep saying no-till. No-till has a diffusion coefficient that's like about 2 orders of magnitude less than conventional tillage. Okay, and we'll take advantage of the fact that our model is semi-dimensionless. So since time is dimensionless, we only need to run one simulation. So we ran one simulation with conventional tillage for 500 years. But if we stretch this result because the low intensity tillage value is 100 times less, this data set also represents a simulation that was run for 50,000 years with the low intensity tillage. Okay. So using those two simulations, we created 5 scenarios. So the first scenario that we studied was a hypothetical case where conventional tillage is used everywhere. The second scenario we studied is to use what present day trends of low intensity tillage are. The third scenario that we did was we decided to mandate in every county, you have to have at least 50% of your area cultivated using low intensity tillage. So in areas that are using more than, or that have more than 50% low intensity tillage, they don't have to do anything. They can just stay at the value, but anywhere that's lower, you have to bump up to 50%. And we did the same for 75%. And then the last scenario is we just said everyone has to use low intensity tillage. Okay, so there's entirely too much data to look at. So we'll just look at one county right here. This is Cerro Gordo in Iowa. And here's what the initial topography looks like and the initial SOC distribution. And that's even still too much data. So if we just zoom in an area, so this is a few square kilometers. Here's a model result at 80 years where we can see the change in topography. So the red areas are where there's erosion and the blue areas are where there's deposition. And then we can also look at what SOC is at 80 years. And you can see that here you can see some bright spots of where there's exposed V horizon, and our model predicts that that area will expand over time. Okay, so there's a lot of data. It's 4-meter resolution across the entire Midwest. So we need to boil down this data somehow. So we calculate these county integrated statistics. So we need to define what we mean by erosion and burial. So by erosion, what we mean is we're just talking about the areas that have been removed from the hilltops, and burial is the stuff that gets deposited. And then we have this word redistribution. So the way the boundary conditions work in the model is that they're closed boundary conditions. So none of the soil is actually leaving the landscape. So a lot of people think of soil erosion as stuff that's actually been evacuated from the landscape. We're not thinking about that. We're just thinking about how is the soil actually being redistributed in the landscapes. And this is an okay assumption to make, because a lot of studies in these areas show that like less than 10% of the material actually leaves the landscape and goes into the drainage network. Most of it just stays very close to where they've been eroded. The soils that have been eroded don't move very far. Okay, and we measure soil erosion, SOC erosion, SOC burial, and then we also track how the surface is changing over time. And to account for low intensity tillage, we take those two simulations that we have. So the one is the conventional tillage simulation, and the other is the low intensity tillage simulation. That's basically a stretch version of the conventional tillage simulation. And we area weight sum them. So if there's area, if the location has more low intensity tillage, the county statistic that we're calculating is more like the low intensity simulation. But if the county is more prepared with conventional tillage, then it's going to be more like the conventional tillage simulation. And then there's the in-between, depending on how much low intensity tillage is actually used in the county. So if we integrate some county results, here's the eroded SOC values. So this is the simulation or the scenario where conventional tillage is used everywhere. And we can see that there are some hotspots of where SOC is actually getting eroded from hilltops. And these areas correlate mostly with locations where there's high curvature and areas where there's lots of SOC in the topsoil. But if we include where people are actually using low intensity tillage, we can see that the distribution is very different. So now the areas that are south of that last glacial maximum are really low, because if you remember from the maps I've been showing of low intensity tillage, they use a lot of low intensity tillage south of the last glacial maximum, and they don't use that much low intensity tillage. They use more conventional tillage north of the last glacial maximum. And that's because the soils typically that are north of the last glacial maximum are more clayey and they need to be prepared more. And then if we mandate a higher low intensity tillage area proportion, we find that the areas north of the last glacial maximum start decreasing, because everywhere south of it already is using more than 50% low intensity tillage. And then if we just say everywhere's got to use low intensity tillage, you can see that the map basically turns black. So low intensity tillage seems to be very effective at reducing SOC erosion. We also looked at the surficial SOC. So surficial SOC is important because that's kind of what decides whether the crops will be productive or not. We find if we average the surficial SOC values in the entire region, that over time it decreases. And in the next 100 years, we calculate that 11%, there'll be 11% reduction in surficial SOC. And that's only assuming, if everything's conventionally tilled. But if we account for where people are actually using low intensity tillage, it's more like a 6.4% reduction in the next 100 years. And then if we mandate that everyone uses at least 50%, every county uses at least 50% low intensity tillage in their county and their fields, we can see that we can prevent about 30% of this reduction. We bump it up to 75%, we get a 57% reduction. And if we say everywhere has to use low intensity tillage, we can reduce the reduction in SOC, the surficial SOC, we can prevent about 96% of the reduction. And we can also look at other parts of the landscape. So the left is the erosional areas. The blue is the depositional areas. And what's interesting is, even though it's the area where there's the highest SOC, we still predict that the surficial SOC will decrease in depositional areas. And then this is just a sum of everything. And the reason why surficial SOC is decreasing in the landscape It's obvious in the erosional areas because you're just removing SOC rich soils, but in the SOC poor, or in the burial zones, SOC poor soils, relatively SOC poor soils are covering the rich soils. So that's why in the depositional areas, even though it's where there's relatively higher values of SOC, you still see it decreasing over time. And then from those results, we find that you can very effectively prevent a lot of this reduction by just having low intensity tillage. And this is important because already, because there's B horizon exposed, there's a lot of reduced crop productivity. So if we continue to till these landscapes, we expect this crop productivity to go down in the future. Okay, so that's what's happening at the surface. Now we'll just think about how much stuff is actually getting redistributed on the landscape. So if we look at the soil erosion, we see that soil erosion increases, or it's accelerated initially, but then it starts to decelerate. And if we, let me back up. Okay, and we see that this soil erosion rate is decreasing over time, and that's because the landscape has a diffusive nature. So because the topography is slowly diffusing and the curvatures are decreasing over time, the soil erosion rates will also decrease over time. And if we account for the current trends of what low intensity tillage is, we see that in the next 100 years, we predict that 8.8 petagrams of soil will erode. And initially in the simulation, we see about a 0.9 millimeter per year average soil erosion rate. And if we compare that to the soil tolerance value of 1 millimeter per year, it's getting very close to it. So if we add low intensity tillage, if we mandate more low intensity tillage, we see that a decrease in soil erosion. So that's 50%, this is 75%, and then this is the total adoption, this orange line. So if we adopt all low intensity tillage everywhere in the landscape, we can reduce in the next 100 years 95% of soil erosion. And then today, if we just adopted low intensity tillage everywhere, we could reduce the soil erosion rate by 98%. So because there's this diffusive effect of the landscape, or diffusive processes that are happening in the landscape, the best time to adopt low intensity tillage, the best time to do it and get the most bang for your buck is to do it now, because the rates are really high. If we do it in 50 years, we're not saving as much soil erosion. So again, the rates that we predict are really high. They're close to the tolerance value. And because it's an average, region average value, it's telling us that in many of the locations, it's actually higher than this 1 millimeter per year rate. And then as we've shown in as I shown previously, this t-value might not even be conservative enough. It might be too high. So maybe actually all the locations are exceeding the natural soil production rates. Okay, and then last, that we just looked at where soil is going. Now we're going to look at where SOC is going, so the carbon that's actually locked into the soil. And we can, in these figures, it shows that the cumulative SOC erosion, it matches very well with what soil erosion is doing. So because soil moves the SOC, the patterns that we see in these plots are about the same as the soil erosion patterns. So we predict that there's going to be 0.17 petagrams of SOC erosion in the next 100 years. And our model predicts a rate of about 12 grams per meter squared per year. And here's rates of the burial. And these burial rates are very similar to the erosion rates. They're not exactly the same because soil erosion accounts for what's getting removed from the hilltops, and the burial accounts for what's getting buried beneath the plow layer. But if you remember in the previous slides, the plow layer and everywhere on the surface, the SOC is decreasing everywhere. So because SOC is decreasing in the plow layer, a lot of it is also getting buried too. So SOC burial ends up being just a little bit larger than the SOC erosion. And to contextualize this rate that we got, this 12 plus or minus 4 grams per meter squared per year, here's a plot by Van Nuys and 6 in a paper that just came out this year that compiled different carbon fluxes, sources, and sinks that are going into the atmosphere. And our red dot is where 12 grams per meter squared per year is. So you can see that the flux that we calculate it's outpacing about 90% of the previously measured carbon source and sinks fluxes. Okay, so our study, just to make sure that you understand, our study does not help solve that debate of whether agricultural soil is a net source or a sink of agricultural or of atmospheric carbon. So we're just telling you, our models just tell us how much stuff is actually moving, but it doesn't tell us what the fate of that carbon is. But the thing that our model can say is that that the landscapes are acting in a diffusive nature. So a lot of the previous estimates of where soil organic carbon, or a lot of the previous studies that look at how agriculture affects atmospheric carbon, they typically rely on having erosion rates that are steady. But what we find is that erosion rates are not steady. They're declining drastically and dramatically over time because the landscapes are diffusive. So if soil erosion has an influence on the global carbon cycle, our models suggest that this influence will decrease over time because the soil erosion rates are decreasing over time. Okay, so to conclude, a lot of our work has shown that soil degradation in the Midwest is widespread, and this is occurring because soil erosion rates outpace the soil production rates. So if you have more leaving than that's coming in, then you're going to degrade your soils. We found that tillage is the main driver of redistributing soil and SOC in these agricultural fields. To us, it seems kind of obvious that if you're driving a tractor with these plows on the back, every year, you're going to move a lot of stuff. We can simulate the tillage mechanism by using a simple diffusion-based landscape evolution model. And using this model, we predicted what soil and SOC redistribution rates are. And we found that those rates are really high, but they can be dramatically decreased if we implement no-till or low-intensity tillage. And that's it. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. It was really, really cool seeing classic kind of landscape modeling being applied to more agricultural based questions. So I think I forgot to mention it at the beginning, but you can either type your questions in the chat, if I see we already have one question, or if you'd rather raise your hand using the reaction button and we'll unmute you. With that said, I'll start by reading the first question by Bradley Miller, who thanks you for the nice presentation and asked, how was curvature calculated for these works?
Yeah, in the model, we just used a first order approximation of what curvature is. So we just use the neighbors, the cardinal direction neighbors to calculate curvature. And that's how we calculate diffusion. But I think Evan's work, they maybe used a slightly different way of calculating curvature. I think they used they fit some sort of surface and got curvature that way. I think it's the way that ArcGIS does it.
All right. I have a quick question, if you don't mind, Michael. It's slightly less specific because this is fairly new to me. So thank you very much, Jeffrey. You sort of led me through that really nicely. It's good to learn something new, I think. I'm just wondering, essentially the conclusions that I've got from here, from what you've talked about, is that, this is something that we really need to be worried about. And certainly there's tillage seems to be a big part of that. And I'm just wondering, as part of the research group in general, what are you guys doing in terms of actually disseminating these results? I mean, you mentioned that this has now been published, which is fantastic, but obviously this is has direct, very practical applications, and it affects agriculture, right? So what is your group doing to try to kind of talk about, I guess, the positives, negatives of tillage and long-term sustainability of agriculture and so on?
Well, first, I'm just a postdoc, so I run the models, but Isaac has talked to many media outlets, newspapers, and TV outlets in the U.S., basically disseminating our results. I'm really excited for this paper to come out because I want to see what people end up thinking about it. But I guess what we've been kind of recommending is that there needs to be some sort of policy shift where they actually include tillage in how they estimate erosion, because it seems like the typical ways that people actually calculate erosion now is they use these really empirical models that are not, they're somewhat physically based, but not really compared to the work that we've done. And they interpolate this data like across the entire US. And their main focus also is just on water erosion, when tillage erosion seems to be having a dominant effect of actually removing stuff from the hilltops. So I guess, yeah, we've been writing all these papers. We've also been talking to the media. And I guess, yeah, I'm excited to see how it actually will be accepted and see if that actually will change policy based on some of our results. But as for now, I'm just postdoc, so I just do the modeling.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I'll ask a quick question, if that's okay, while we're waiting for other people to type. So you talk in your model kind of thinks about how different tillage will impact erosion, right? So it'll so let's think about the best case scenario where we completely stop erosion. Do you have any estimation of how long it will take for the landscape to kind of reach back its equilibrium, right? Because we were already losing the topsoil.
So if we just implement low intensity tillage, it'll essentially, I guess in our lifetime, kind of just freeze everything. So in order for soils to actually, the soil thicknesses on the hilltops to actually regenerate, that's something that our model can't do because there's no carbon dynamics. So the assumption in this model is that, we're just moving everything. We're not actually seeing how things are occurring, like what's actually occurring in the soils. So I can't answer that without that sort of model. There have been like test cases where they've stopped tillage and they just implement a no-till, and they see that there is regeneration of the A horizon fairly quickly.
Okay, do we have more questions on the chat? No, I do have also a quick question. Maybe I missed in the meanwhile during the presentation, but do you have any way, or how do you incorporate error in the long-term scenarios that you are doing in terms of organic carbon?
Yeah, so the main way that we're doing that, so we do have these error bars in some of these simulations. The main way that we're propagating that is we looked at the range of diffusion coefficients that people have calculated. So we used a median value or center value of 0.5 meters squared per year, but then this error bar shows calculations for plus and minus 1 standard deviation. So it's like 0.3, I think it's like 0.37 to 0.67. So the error comes from our uncertainty in what the diffusion coefficient might be. But they've found that if you plow agricultural fields, the diffusion coefficient kind of has a narrow range of coefficients. And the nice thing about our model also is that there's not many parameters in the model. So there's not many sources of uncertainty, at least in the parameters.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, I think there are no more questions from the audience, or at least maybe none that they want to ask out here. Maybe they'll reach out to you personally.
Yeah, you can feel free to reach out and I can answer those questions.
So I'm going to thank you again. I want to thank Lizzie and Rita as well for co-chairing this with me. And I invite everybody to join us next week.